There comes a moment when the world goes silent, when your strength shatters, and everything inside you whispers, "Give up." But what if that moment is not your end, but your awakening? This is not just a story. It is a battle, a fire, and a truth that will shake you. Because no matter how hard it gets, what you do next changes everything. The rain came down like shattered glass. Cold, sharp, unforgiving. His shirt clung to his skin, soaked and heavy. The streetlights flickered above, casting shadows that moved like ghosts. Each step echoed on the empty pavement. Alone, but not unnoticed. Behind him, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, measured like a clock ticking closer to midnight. His breath quickened. The air smelled of rust and wet concrete. His fingers trembled as he reached into his pocket. Nothing. No phone. No keys. No escape. A crack of thunder split the sky. He turned. No one there. Only the endless black of the alley behind him. His heart pounded like a war drum in his chest. But he moved forward. He kept going. Not because he was not afraid, but because he refused to stop. The city around him was falling apart. Windows shattered. Sirens screamed in the distance. Neon signs buzzed like dying insects. He walked past a mirror shop. Every reflection cracked. But one. It stared back at him. Unbroken. Smiling. Not his smile. Not his face. He stumbled back, breath caught in his throat. A chill wrapped around his spine like a coil. But still he moved. One foot. Then the other. Because when the world turns dark, when the walls close in, when even your own shadow tries to leave you behind, you must remember, pain does not mean you are finished. Fear does not mean you are lost. He reached a door at the end of the alley. Old wood. Faded paint. A single word carved into it, choose. His hand hovered. Behind him, silence twisted into a low whisper. No words. Just the sound of something breathing. He opened the door. Blinding light. Heat surged into his face, like fire unleashed. Inside, a staircase spiraled into nothingness. He looked up. He looked down. He could turn back, but his legs moved before his mind decided. Every step burned, each one louder than the last. Screams rose from below. Laughter echoed from above. But he climbed, because there's no growth in the comfort zone, and there's no comfort where real growth begins. The higher he went, the darker it became, until even his hands disappeared in front of him. But he kept reaching, kept climbing, because he understood. The only way out is through. No matter how hard it gets, no matter how cold it feels, no matter how loud the voices whisper in the dark, you do not stop. You do not collapse. You do not surrender your soul to silence. And just when his strength faded, just when his breath gave out, a single step cracked beneath him, and he fell. He fell, not like a leaf drifting gently to the ground, but like a stone hurled from the hand of something unseen, fast, brutal, merciless. The air rushed past his ears, howling like a beast that had waited for this moment. His limbs flailed, not to save him, but in a final, desperate protest. His mind raced, splintered, then slowed. Time stretched. It did not pass, it pulled. Images flashed before his eyes, not memories, but warnings. A child, crying in the corner of a dark room. A man on his knees, hands bloody. A woman screaming at a door that would not open. All versions of him. All truths he had buried beneath a mask of progress. And still he fell. Deeper. Harder. Into a void where light did not exist, where echoes of old failures clawed at his skin. He thought it would never end, but then, impact. Not with the earth, not with stone, but with silence. A silence so thick it muffled even his heartbeat. He lay there, unbroken yet shattered. The floor beneath him was smooth, cold, wet, like glass pulled from a frozen river. He gasped, lungs sucking in air that tasted like metal. His fingers twitched. He moved, slowly, painfully. Every joint protested, every nerve screamed, but he rose. Not because he felt strong, but because he had fallen too far to stay down. Around him, darkness breathed. Walls pulsed with movement just beyond his sight. The ceiling above was gone, swallowed by shadows that moved like waves. He stood on what seemed to be the last solid place left in a world collapsing inward. In the distance, a faint light, red, pulsing, like a heartbeat, like something alive. He walked toward it, each step slower than the last. The ground cracked behind him with every footfall, threatening to erase the path he had taken. But still he moved. The red light grew, illuminating a figure chained to the wall. It was him, eyes open, mouth sewn shut, skin covered in words, failures, regrets, lies. Words he had spoken to himself when no one else was listening. Words like worthless, broken, weak. He reached out to touch it, but the figure flinched, recoiled, and vanished into dust. In its place, a door appeared. Tall, black, breathing. Every breath it took sounded like thunder wrapped in a whisper. He reached for the handle, cold and slick like oil. As his fingers closed around it, a voice spoke, not aloud, but from within. "You are not ready." He gripped harder. The door pulsed. "You are afraid." He turned the handle. "You will fail again." He pushed. It opened. The world beyond the door was not a place. It was a memory, but not just his. Everyone's. The collective screams of every person who had ever given up. Every soul crushed beneath the weight of not enough. A battlefield stretched before him, endless. People fought monsters shaped like doubt, fear, shame. Some fought with fists, others with tears. Many lay still, defeated, forgotten. But a few kept rising, bleeding, breaking, rising again. He stepped into the battlefield, and instantly something grabbed him. Long arms, pale skin, eyes hollow, endless. It whispered, "Why try again? Why bleed for a world that does not care? Its grip tightened. Why fight when you know you will lose?" He struggled, but it held firm. Another voice spoke from behind, a child's voice. Soft, terrified. "Do not give up. Please." "Not yet." The monster hissed. "You are alone." But he remembered. He remembered that voice. The one he once used, begging someone else to keep going. Someone who never did. Rage surged through him, white-hot and pure. He screamed, not in fear, but in defiance. The scream became fire. The fire became light. The creature shrieked, recoiled, and vanished into the shadows. Around him, others turned. Some stood. Some cried. Some reached for their weapons again. Hope returned, fragile but present. He moved forward, past the battlefield, past the pain, until he reached a hill at the center of it all. Upon it stood a throne, empty, rusted, ancient. A crown lay beside it, cracked down the middle. No one ruled this place. Not yet. He approached the throne, looked down at his hands. Scarred, burned, trembling. Not perfect, but powerful. Because they had built something from nothing. Because they had held on when everything else let go. He did not sit. He did not take the crown. He turned around and looked back. At the battlefield. At the door. At the fall. He understood now. This journey was not about winning. Not about proving worth. It was about becoming. The darkness would return. The monsters would change faces. The whispers would come again. But now he would answer them. Not with silence. Not with surrender. But with movement. With fire. With fight. Because no matter how hard it gets, no matter how far you fall, no matter how many times you scream into a void that does not answer, you rise. You rise shaking. You rise broken. You rise bleeding. But you rise. Because pain is proof that you are still alive. Because fear means you still care. Because the hardest paths are the ones worth walking. He stepped down from the hill. Others followed. Not behind him. Beside him. The world did not suddenly grow easier. The monsters did not vanish. But neither did he. He had learned something the darkness never expected. That the light does not always come from above. Sometimes it burns from within. And when you refuse to quit, when you rise through the fire, when you keep walking even with shattered bones and a trembling heart, you become the light. You become the fire. You become the reason someone else does not give up. And that is how you win, no matter how hard it gets. He stood there, not as a victor wearing a crown, but as a survivor bearing scars that told the real story. every loss, every betrayal, every moment he thought he would not make it. And yet he did. And because he did, others could too. Around him, the ground shifted, not with chaos, but with potential. From the cracks where despair once leaked, small lights began to bloom. Not bright at first, just glimmers, flickers, but they grew. The battlefield did not disappear, but it changed. The pain remained, but it was no longer meaningless. It had form, direction. It had become fuel. Behind him, the path that had nearly killed him stood open, inviting the next soul brave enough to walk through. Not because it was safe, but because it mattered. He looked at his hands again, still trembling, still scarred, but capable of lifting others, of pointing to the path, of fighting when no one else could. He took another step, and with it, a child emerged from the smoke, a younger version of himself, wide-eyed and frightened. Not the polished image he wanted the world to see, but the raw truth he had buried deep. The boy who once cried alone in silence, who once begged for someone to understand, who once stared into the mirror and wished he was someone else. He kneeled before that child, and instead of turning away, he opened his arms. The boy ran to him, and when they embraced, something inside shifted. The broken pieces began to fit, not to erase the cracks, but to make something new, something stronger. He stood again, taller now, not in height, but in spirit. The monsters around him had not left. They simply stepped back, watching, waiting. They knew now he would never run. They would come again, as they always did, dressed in different faces, whispering new lies. But he would be ready, because when you face the darkness long enough, you stop fearing it. You start understanding it, and in that understanding, you find power, not in never falling, but in always rising. He walked through the battlefield, and with every step, someone stood up, not because he told them to, but because they saw him, saw the scars, the fire, the will. They recognized something in him that lived within them too. And suddenly, rising did not feel like an impossible task. It felt like a shared truth, like a rhythm, like the beating of one heart inside many bodies. This was not a rescue. It was a reminder. And then came the storm. The sky cracked open, and rain poured down again, colder than before, more violent. The light faded. The monsters returned, angrier now. The battlefield groaned beneath their weight. But this time he did not flinch. He did not brace for impact. He welcomed it. Because hardship is not the enemy, it is the gatekeeper. It does not punish the weak. It reveals the strong. And so he moved into the storm, not with armor, but with purpose. Lightning lit the sky, and in that flash, he saw thousands moving forward with him, each one carrying their own pain, their own demons, their own stories. And yet they moved as one. Not flawless, not fearless, but unbroken. They had found their reason. And once you have a reason, pain becomes bearable. Fear becomes irrelevant. Failure becomes fuel. A creature lunged at him, mouth wide with jagged teeth of doubt. He caught it midair, looked into its eyes, and said, "I know who you are. I know what you are. But you no longer control me." And he crushed it, not with strength, but with truth. The battlefield shook as more monsters fell, not by force, but by understanding. That is the secret no one tells you. The fight is not out there. It is in here, inside, in the mind, in the soul. The battle is against the version of yourself that once believed you were not enough. And as he stood in the heart of that storm, soaked to the bone, exhausted and bruised, he smiled, not because the pain was gone, but because he knew it would return. And he no longer feared it, because every time it came, he would rise again, and again, and again, no matter how hard it gets. Because the truth is, nothing worth becoming is ever easy. Growth does not come in comfort. Peace is not found in avoidance. The strength you seek is forged in nights of doubt, in mornings where you rise with tears still on your face, in days where the only victory is simply not giving up. The storm began to break, just slightly. A golden hue crept into the sky. Not full light, but enough. Enough to see the faces of those beside him. Enough to remember why he started. Enough to believe again. He looked at the path ahead. It was not straight. It was jagged, crooked, dangerous. But he smiled again, softer this time, because now he knew. It did not matter how steep the climb was. It did not matter how many times he fell. It did not matter how long it took or how dark it got. All that mattered was this: he would not stop. Not now. Not ever. And neither should you. Because you will fall. You will bleed. You will cry. And sometimes, the world will feel like it is trying to break you for good. But you will keep moving. Even if your steps are small. Even if your hands shake. Even if your voice trembles. Because something inside you refuses to quit. Something inside you burns brighter than any fear. That something is will. And will is stronger than circumstance. Stronger than pain. Stronger than failure. So when the road turns cruel, when the nights feel endless, when your heart feels hollow, remember this: you are not done. You are not broken. You are still becoming. Asterisk, asterisk. And no matter how hard it gets, you rise. He rose not with the certainty of victory, but with the stubbornness of someone who refuses to vanish. Every fiber in his body ached. Every bone felt the weight of the world. But he pushed forward, not because he wanted to, but because something deep inside whispered that he must. The world was still burning, still shifting, still trying to swallow him whole. But that whisper grew louder, turning into a roar inside his chest. It was not courage. It was not strength. It was something older, deeper, more primal. It was the decision to keep going when everything else says stop. Around him, the others kept moving too. Not in perfect unity, not in flawless formation, but with raw, messy, desperate persistence. Some crawled, some limped, some screamed into the void as they clawed their way forward. But none of them stopped. That was the power they had now. Not invincibility, not immunity to pain, but movement, and in movement they found meaning. The storm above had not ceased. It only changed form. The winds became voices, whispers that tried to twist the truth. You are wasting your time. No one sees you. This is all for nothing. But he kept walking. Every lie he had ever believed came back, dressed in thunder and shadows, clawing at his back like familiar ghosts. But he had heard them all before. And now he answered them, not with words, but with steps. Each footfall was a declaration. I am still here. I am still moving. I am not finished. That was what scared the darkness the most. Not the fire, not the fight, but the refusal to stop walking. He reached the edge of a cliff where the ground simply ended, jagged rocks and nothingness below. The others caught up, forming a line beside him. The path behind had collapsed. There was no going back. Ahead was only air, an abyss, another impossible place. But he did not look down. He looked up, and for the first time, he saw stars. Faint, distant, but there. Real. They did not offer a solution. They offered hope. And sometimes that is enough. He closed his eyes, took a breath, and stepped forward, not into the fall, but into the unknown. The air held him for a moment, and in that moment, he remembered every second he had doubted himself, every night he had screamed into pillows, every time he wanted to disappear. But then, his foot touched something solid, invisible to the eye, but real beneath the soul. A path, hidden until he moved. And that was the truth of life. It does not reveal itself to the frozen. It opens only to those who take the step, even when they cannot see the ground. The others followed, and the path grew beneath their feet. Not wide, not easy, but real. With each step, the stars above grew brighter, not because they had changed, but because now they were seen. And in that starlight, they began to remember who they were before the fear, before the failure, before the world tried to teach them to stay small. The man walked on, and the air changed. It grew warmer, but not in comfort, more like fire. Not the kind that burns, but the kind that forges. Ahead, a massive gate rose from the mist, carved with the faces of every version of himself he had outgrown. The coward, the liar, the quitter, the lost. He touched the gate, and it pulsed with memories, moments of regret, voices he had silenced, chances he had thrown away. But instead of recoiling, he placed his hand flat and whispered, I forgive you. And the gate opened. Inside was not a throne, not a treasure, not applause. Inside was a mirror. Not glass, but liquid. Alive. It rippled as he approached. Showed not what he looked like, but what he carried. The weight of guilt. The echo of rejection. The pressure to be more. To prove more. To feel less. He stared into it and saw a man who had failed more times than he had succeeded, but also a man who stood anyway. That was enough. That was everything. He stepped through the mirror. It felt like falling again, but softer. He landed not in a new place, but in the same world, the same battlefield, the same broken sky. But now he saw it clearly. The monsters were not real, they were fears. The storm was not punishment, it was transformation. The pain was not punishment. It was proof that he still felt, still tried, still cared. The people around him still fought, still bled, still cried. But they looked at him differently now. Not as a savior, not as a leader, but as one of them. One who bled, one who fell, one who never stopped rising. He walked among them, sat with the ones who could not stand yet, lifted the ones who had forgotten how to move. Not with speeches, not with orders, but with presence, with proof, because when someone who has been to the bottom stands beside you, you believe it is possible to rise. He began to build, not a monument to his struggle, but a place where others could rest, could remember, could begin again. Others joined him, not because they were finished with their pain, but because they had found purpose within it. Together, they built a space not free of darkness, but filled with light strong enough to face it. And in the center of it all stood a fire, not wild, not consuming, but steady, relentless, a flame made of choice, of effort, of will. He fed it with every doubt he let go, every lie he no longer carried, every fear he had walked through and left behind. And the flame grew. People came from across the battlefield to see it, to warm themselves, to remember they were not alone, to begin again. And every time someone asked, "How did you survive?" he answered simply, "I did not stop." Not when it hurt, not when I was afraid, not when the whole world told me it was over. I took one more step, and then another, and then another, and every step became a message. You can fall, you can break, you can scream, but you can also heal. You can rise, you can fight, you can live. No matter how hard it gets, you do not stop. You keep going, and you become the reason. The light never dies. And that light, fueled by every failure, every scream swallowed in silence, every night spent staring at the ceiling wondering if it was even worth it, burned brighter with each person who gathered around. They came in all forms, some with fresh wounds still bleeding, some with eyes hollow from loss, some too tired to speak. But they came, drawn not by perfection, but by the honesty of pain endured and turned into power. The man stood among them, no longer needing to shout, no longer needing to explain. His presence was enough. Because when you carry your scars with pride, others no longer hide theirs in shame. They saw him and realized they did not have to pretend to be whole. They only had to be willing to rebuild. One brick of effort, one stone of honesty, one breath of hope at a time. He saw a woman kneeling at the edge of the fire. Her hands trembled as she reached toward the warmth. Her eyes, hollow like a cave that had forgotten the sun. He knelt beside her and placed a hand on her back, not to save her, but to remind her she was not invisible. She looked at him, tears brimming but unfallen, and whispered, "I do not think I can make it." And he replied not with empty encouragement, but with truth. "You already are. You are breathing. You are here. That is the first fight, and you are winning it." Her lips quivered, not with weakness, but with the beginning of belief. She was not alone anymore. And sometimes, that is all it takes to shift a soul, to know that someone else understands the weight you carry without needing to explain every detail of it. Children came too, not untouched by pain, but too young to know what to do with it. They sat around the fire, listening to stories not of triumph alone, but of struggle, of falling and rising again, of fear faced head-on. Their wide eyes did not search for heroes in capes, but for truth. They watched those who had walked through the storm and learned something no book could teach, that bravery is not loud. It is not shiny. It is quiet, relentless. the willingness to try again after every failure, to get up when the world begs you to stay down. And soon, from the edge of the firelight, others emerged. The broken, the bitter, the forgotten, the silent warriors no one had noticed before. They came not to be healed, but to be seen. And once they were seen, they started to remember something long buried, that they mattered, that their pain was not weakness, but proof of how hard they had fought. The fire welcomed them all. It did not judge. It only burned brighter. The man walked among them, not as a prophet, not as a savior, but as proof. And the more he walked, the more his steps became rhythm. Others began to follow, forming paths of their own. Not all forward. Some paths curved. Some circled. Some paused. But they moved. And movement, even slow, even painful, is life. It is resistance. It is hope in motion. One night, the storm returned. Fiercer than before. Wind howled like the cries of old ghosts. Rain fell like needles from a sky tearing itself open. The fire hissed, threatened to die. People huddled together, faces tense with the fear that it was happening again, that everything they had built would be washed away. The man stood alone in the storm center, soaked, eyes closed, listening. And what he heard was not destruction, but renewal. The storm was not here to end them. It was here to test them, to remind them that comfort is not where strength is born. Strength is forged in the flood, the wind, the chaos. So he stepped closer to the fire, dropped to his knees, cupped his hands, and shielded the flame. Others joined, one by one, arms outstretched, bodies hunched against the storm, not to extinguish it, but to protect the fire together. And in that moment, something unspoken happened. They became more than survivors. They became keepers of the flame, guardians of each other's will. And even as the storm screamed, the fire survived, not because it was mighty, but because they were united. When dawn finally broke, it was not golden or grand. It was pale, fragile, a whisper of light through gray clouds. But it was enough to see each other clearly, enough to know they had made it through one more night. And when the man looked at the flame, now steady again, he realized something profound. The fire had never belonged to him. It belonged to them, to every soul that had fallen and chosen to rise, to every voice that had shaken but still spoken, to every hand that had reached for help instead of pretending to be fine. He stood and raised his eyes to the sky, not in victory, but in acknowledgement. The world would bring more storms, more nights of doubt, more trials to test their spirit, but the fire would remain, because now it was shared, passed from heart to heart, hand to hand, scar to scar. And then, something even more unexpected happened. They began to sing. Not loudly, not perfectly, but with honesty, with unity. A song not of triumph, but of truth. A melody built on broken voices that found strength in singing together. Their voices echoed into the valley, into the broken lands beyond, and from those distant places, others began to respond. Soft at first, then louder, then unstoppable. A chorus of the fallen refusing to stay down. A choir of the scarred, choosing to rise. The man smiled, not because the pain was gone, not because the road was easy, but because now they would walk it together. And in that togetherness, he knew, they would never be alone again. They would never stop again. Because once you have heard the song of the unbroken, you cannot go back to silence. No matter how hard it gets, you move forward. You lift others. You carry the flame. And in doing so, you change everything. And as the song traveled across the ruined landscape, it reached places where light had never touched. Dark corners of forgotten cities. Crumbled ruins where hope had withered into dust. Within those shadows, souls stirred. People who had buried their dreams so deep they had almost forgotten the sound of their own names. The song reached them like a whisper at first, threading between cracked walls and broken windows. A hum in the silence, a vibration in the bones, and something within them twitched, not in fear, but in recognition. Because the song was not perfect, it was not polished, it did not pretend. It carried the weight of grief and the ache of survival. And in that weight, there was truth. It said, "You are not too late. You are not too broken. You are still worthy of the fire." One by one, they began to emerge, faces pale from years of hiding, hands trembling from lack of use, eyes wide not with wonder, but with disbelief. Could it really be for them too? This warmth, this rhythm, this chance to begin again. The firekeepers welcomed them not with speeches or demands, but with silence and open space. A place to sit, a place to breathe, a place to be. And slowly, their bodies began to remember movement. Their hearts remembered how to beat for more than survival. Their mouths, long stitched shut by shame, began to murmur verses of the song. Off-key, uncertain, beautiful. The man watched as the fire grew, not taller, but deeper. It no longer needed fuel. It was fed by presence, by the decision to stay, to witness, to endure. It was no longer his burden. It was everyone's light. And though he had once feared being forgotten, he now hoped it would be so. Not because he had not mattered, but because if the fire lived on without his name, it meant it had become greater than him. Children danced now, barefoot in the ash, laughing without understanding why. Elders smiled quietly, their eyes heavy with what had been lost, but no longer bitter. Survivors with missing limbs learned new ways to move, to build, to lead. Artists began painting again, not portraits of perfection, but murals of survival. Hands that once clenched in fear opened wide to create, to give, to lift. The community that formed around the flame was not flawless. It argued, it struggled, it failed often, but it returned to the fire, to each other, again and again. And that returning, that choice to come back, was its true strength. One evening, a young boy approached the man with eyes too sharp for his age. He asked, "Is it always going to be this hard?" The man knelt, looked him in the eye, and answered, "Yes, but that is not the whole truth." The boy tilted his head, waiting. The man continued, "It will be hard. It will hurt. You will fall. But each time you rise, it gets clearer. You stop fearing the pain. You stop fearing the dark, because you learn that nothing it throws at you can erase who you are." The boy nodded, and in that small nod was the birth of another firekeeper. Soon, they began to send out paths, ribbons of light stretching into the world, lighting up hidden roads and broken trails. Each path was not a rescue mission. It was an invitation, a signal to anyone still lost that the flame existed, and they would be welcomed if they came. Some answered quickly, others took longer, and some never did. But the firekeepers did not measure their worth by how many arrived. They kept the flame burning because it was right, because in a world that had tried to teach them to numb their hearts, they had chosen instead to feel deeply. The seasons shifted. Storms came and went. Old fears resurfaced. New challenges formed. But the fire remained. And with each trial, they built more than resistance. They built resilience. Not just the ability to survive, but the skill to thrive after pain. The wisdom to carry sorrow without becoming it. The courage to tell the truth even when the world preferred silence. And as time passed, people began to tell stories, not of how perfect they had become, but of the cracks they carried. Stories of moments when they almost gave up, when the weight became unbearable, when the lies almost convinced them that they were not enough, and how, in those moments, someone reached for them, or they reached for someone else, or they remembered the song, or the warmth, or the single truth that had saved them again and again. You do not have to be unbroken to be worthy of healing. The man aged, but he did not grow weary. His body slowed, but his spirit burned hotter than ever. He watched generations grow up around the fire, watched old enemies break bread beside one another, watched grief turn into gardens, and trauma turn into truth that could be carried, not hidden. And when his time neared, when his breath grew shallow and the lines on his face told stories more vivid than words, he sat one last time by the flame. They gathered around him, not in mourning, but in gratitude. He did not speak of legacy. He did not ask for remembrance. He simply said, "Keep the fire." And they knew he meant more than the flames before them. He meant the fire within, the relentless will to continue, to build, to rise again. When his final breath left his chest, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like an ember passed from one soul to many, a transfer of light, a quiet roar in the chest of every person who had been saved not by miracles, but by the decision to keep going. And that is how the fire lived on, not in the memory of one man, but in the countless footsteps of those who, despite the pain, the fear, the impossible odds, chose to take one more step. No matter how hard it gets, you do not close your heart. You do not silence your truth. You do not give the dark the last word. You walk. You carry the flame. And one day, someone else will find their light, because you never let yours die. And now, as the fire still flickers, gently in the heart of everything we have built, let us pause, not in sorrow, but in reverence, for every scar that became a story, for every tear that watered strength, for every step taken when quitting seemed easier. You have heard the pain. You have felt the weight. You have seen the darkness. But you are still here, breathing, standing, burning. And that means something. That means everything. Because this journey was never about being perfect. It was about being persistent. It was never about avoiding the storm. It was about learning how to dance in the rain. You will fall again. You will doubt again. But when that moment comes, remember this. You are not alone. You never were. There's a fire waiting to warm you, a voice waiting to remind you, a hand waiting to lift you. So carry this flame in your chest. Carry it through the silence, through the setbacks, through the nights that seem endless. Let it be your reminder that no matter how hard it gets, you have already walked through more than you thought you could, and you are still moving, still fighting, still becoming. This is not the end. It is another beginning. Stand tall. Breathe deep. Walk forward, because your fire is not just yours anymore. It lights the way for someone else. So keep going, keep believing, and never forget, the fire lives on in you.